What is up, guys? Silver Warrior here, and in this video I'd like to discuss my thoughts on precious metals and an economic collapse. But before we do this, I think it's pretty important that we first evaluate what exactly an economic collapse is, and more specifically the difference between it and an economic crisis, using two real-world examples. So in an economic collapse, essentially you'd see a complete breakdown of the economy. This being the Great Depression, the effects of which were felt, of course, around the world. But we'll look at specifically the United States in this comparison I'm about to bring up to the Great Recession of the end of 2007 to 2009, where essentially the difference being that you saw during the Great Recession the peak unemployment reaching around 10% and about a 4.2% decrease in the GDP of the United States from the beginning to the end. Whereas if you look at the Great Depression, there was about a quarter of the nation unemployed, and from 1929 to 1934, the GDP experienced approximately a 36% decrease. So quite obviously, the statistics for the Great Depression are much more staggering, right? And the quality of life of the average United States citizen very significantly decreased in the Great Depression in relation to the Great Recession. So at this point, you might be thinking, well, why don't you then just look at what precious metals did during the Great Depression? If you say that was an economic collapse, then why don't we just see how precious metals were performing then? And the answer to that is really quite simple. For one, there were no precious metals. There was a precious metal, that being gold. And if you are not aware, essentially the value of gold was fixed during this time. Nations actually, rather than having a fiat currency, used something known as the gold standard, which meant that, for one, gold prices could not fluctuate. They were a fixed amount, or the price of gold, rather, was a fixed amount that was established by the government. And for two, you could go into any bank that you were a part of course, and essentially tell them, I have this amount in paper cash, show it to them, and say I want an equal amount in gold, and they would have it on hand to give to you. So rather than being backed by a promise, the dollar was actually backed by a tangible metal, that being, of course, gold. So the reason then that we can't really look at how precious metals performed then is because what happened to gold is it was actually outlawed in terms of being privately owned. And there were exceptions made. I believe dentists could still own up to 100 ounces, but the average person could not privately own gold. And this was done in April of 1933. And the reason being was because of the fact that at the time, FDR was trying to produce more money in order to be able to create a bunch of public projects, right? This was his idea, the New Deal, to pull the U.S. out of the Great Depression. And he couldn't do this simply because of the fact that many people were taking gold out of the banks because they were no longer trusting the government. They saw the economic turmoil going on. They wanted their gold rather than having currency. So the problem for him then in producing any more money is that you couldn't produce more money than you could back with gold. So the problem there was that he was essentially running out of gold to back money with. So the thought was that, well, if we rather ban the private ownership of gold, force people to sell their gold to the feds, then we can produce more money. It was really simple. But in August of 1971, the United States was actually taken off the gold standard. And what this means is that the government can now, the Federal Reserve, rather, can actually produce as much money as they'd really like to. And the government can borrow as much money as they'd like to from the Federal Reserve. And because of the fact that gold no longer is backing it, the chances of gold being outlawed, or any precious metal being outlawed, is very slim in relation to during the Great Depression. Banning the ownership of precious metals would not be to the same benefit that it was during the Great Depression, because you can produce however much money and inflate the currencies however much you want, no matter how much gold, silver, or any other precious metal the government holds. So if there were to be a modern-day economic collapse, and of course this is purely my opinion, hence the title, My Opinion, I do believe that, yes, precious metals value would be driven up significantly. I believe people would, if they began to really sense economic turmoil, they would turn away from intangibles like cryptos and stocks and instead seek tangibles like precious metals. Furthermore, I believe that companies would, maybe at first, if they didn't believe an economic collapse was coming, be willing to sell because, of course, they're making significantly more money from precious metals. But if there was if it was very apparent, rather, that a full-on economic collapse that might last a decade or more was coming, I don't see major companies like, let's say, ATMEX, JM Bullion, Provident Metals, all of them, really wanting to sell precious metals for what is going to soon be worthless paper, right? If an economic collapse happens, there's a good chance that we're going to see something called hyperinflation, where essentially your money becomes valueless. Now, to me, it already is kind of valueless, but of course that's another video entirely. But at the very least, if you have money, you have buying power. And in hyperinflation, you wouldn't have any buying power from the US dollar anymore. So I don't see major companies wanting to sell their precious metals anymore for fiat, right? Because I don't believe that they would, there'd be no incentive to sell. You could offer any amount of fiat currency and it wouldn't be worth it because precious metals are obviously tangible and thus are going to retain their value. So therefore, what I'm trying to say is that you would really have to start stocking up pretty early as soon as you started to see any sign of economic turmoil if you wanted to get in on precious metals and you hadn't already. I think the easiest thing is to prepare beforehand. But then what I'm trying to say furthermore is that yes, at first, precious metals would increase in value, but very quickly there'd be nothing to buy precious metals with because our dollar would no longer be worth anything. And so it would very much be either you have precious metals or you don't. And who knows how long an economic collapse would last. You're talking about the United States here, right? That's the nation I live in, so that's the nation I'm speaking for here. It wouldn't be, to me, very feasible for a full-on economic collapse to occur. I think that another economic crisis is certainly in our future, but an economic collapse, at least in the near future, just doesn't really seem all that plausible. But if it were to happen, that's kind of how I believe it would play out. I think at first, yes, there'd be people willing to sell silver and gold because they'd be making large profits, but eventually, like I said, you wouldn't have anything to buy silver and gold with, so it'd either be you had it or you didn't. And I do believe that during this time, your wealth would be measured in precious metals. I think that that would be the standard of how much money, if you will, somebody had, because what else would really be used? Either way, though, if we're talking about a full-on situation of just anarchy, then silver and gold are still not going to be the most important thing, because if you have a bunch of silver and gold, you might want something to protect it with, so stocking up on weapons, on ammunition, being able to go off the grid, being able to be self-sufficient, that is going to be key, right? But in a situation like the Great Depression where we still have an established government, that's obviously not going to be the most important thing, but rather simply the ownership of precious metals. And of course, this is all my opinion, like I said, so please do not take this as me trying to say anything about how it would actually play out. That's just how I think it would play out. I have no idea really what would happen. I'm in no position to know what would happen, and I need to make that very clear right now. I do hope you enjoyed the video, though. I really hope that you contribute your thoughts in the comments below. And check out all the links in the description below. That is where I got all the statistics used and just filled in any gaps in my own knowledge from. Peace.